Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our session. Those of you who were here last year, we introduced some of the sort of more fundamentals around soil compaction and also the machinery interface. And so this year we've taken a different view on it. We've combined the theory, so there's a little bit of theory in our presentation, but more importantly, we've actually put a full compaction trial. Many of you come and visited, and we shared those results with you, and we'll go into more detail about that really important area between our soil and soil health and obviously our machinery. So I'm not doing this alone. Michelin have sponsored this trial, and Tom Saunders, who's sitting in the front row here, he'll join me in a minute, but much of the work has been done by Michelin as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy some of the things that actually we've learned, as well as some of the theory that we all probably know fairly well, really. So just a few words. Michelin have sponsored this trial, but Groundswell obviously have hosted the trial, and between the local dealer, Tuckwells, John Deere, and Datafield, who lent us some of the equipment to do the test work, we put this short study together, really. So with that, I'll carry on. I'm going to divide it into sort of three parts, really. The first part is a bit about the theory, which I shared last year. Second part is the results. And if we've got time, we've got the PA system, we can go up onto the trial site, and we can actually have a look at what we did and some of the kind of results from that, really. But I thought I'd start, really, take one step back. We're all very familiar, those of you who've been to Groundswell for some time, we're familiar with the basic soil health principles, and I won't dwell on those too much because many people here have spoken more eloquently than I can about them. But I've kind of taken the liberty really to add a fifth one, and I feel very passionate about this, as many of you all know, because if we do all this good stuff and then we kind of mess it up with our machinery, and of course then we undo much of the good that we've done. So I've added a fifth, really, managing the machinery interface, and particularly around weight, around tyre pressures, and tyre choices, machinery selection, and things like that. So really, I think you're all, no surprises here to anyone, but you'll all be very aware of the damage that weight can have on our soils. And I think you might actually surprise yourself just how much damage really can be done to soils on a temporary basis, and more importantly, on a very permanent basis as well. So it's extremely damaging. And these are just a few pictures that I've taken, and people often wonder why I pull over at the side of the road and take some picture of a field, but you can see there all of those, I would argue, are results of the machinery interface. And the good news is much of it can be mitigated, much can be managed, much of it can be mitigated by modern tyre technology and some basic education, which is what we're about in this short study, really. So what we've seen over the years, obviously, is great strides in machinery, and we're very responsible for that because productivity has gone up, and that's been the real benefit from machinery size going up. But of course, the more negative side, really, or the more manageable side that we have to manage, is that our axle weights have gone up, and they have gone up quite significantly. And that line keeps growing, and many of you will recognize there's machines out there with vehicle weights well in excess of 30 tons and axle weights increasing over 15 tons. And what that's done really is it's driven our damage to our soils further down into the soil profile. So it's not just surface damage, which can be managed relatively easy, but we've driven that damage in our soils further down the soil profile. And that's more challenging because it's more difficult to actually remediate and actually get that out. So it's more permanent, more persistent, and something that we really need to try and avoid. And there's lots of risk factors, and those of you who have been involved in machinery or involved in soils, or the combination of the two, for many years will kind of appreciate that list there. It's not exhaustive, but I think you'll appreciate there are many different things: too many passes, poor traffic management, high tyre pressures. You'll see the results from that in a moment. It's quite staggering. Late harvest, and of course with many of our crops now, we're on soils when they're much more vulnerable later on in the season. Incorrect settings of machines, particularly tine depth, loosened and weak soil. Obviously that's when we're drilling very often. Poor and low soil organic carbon or matter. That's a much less resilient soil to compaction. High wheel slip, often a cause of tyre pressures. Wet soils and high axle loads. And the list could go on, but there's certainly some of the more important areas that cause us huge amount of risk and potential damage to our soils. And of course, it's not cheap to put this compaction in, because very often if you're running at higher tyre pressures, higher axle loads, the cost of that is fuel. And so you're spending more money putting this damage into our soils. Of course, you're spending more money having to try and get this damage back out of our soils. And the really frightening thing is it's incredibly persistent. and you see it for many, many years. A wet harvest, you see for many harvests to come in the damage to emergence and plant growth. So there's some particularly high-risk environments. Those of you won't be surprised by this list, but if you've got an environment where you've got things like high axle loads or a combination of these, high tire pressures, wet soil conditions, and we've often got these combinations, loosened, weakened soils, and particularly on heavier soils, so the damage goes up on our heavier soil types, then that picture I kind of lifted, but that's a classic example where probably you've got all of those different factors together, and that is a situation that sometimes we can't avoid. But trust me, if we can avoid, then long term we will thank ourselves, because short term that damage looks horrendous, but it will continue for some considerable amount of time, I would argue. If ever, you'll be able to get it back out again, and that's another argument. So we all dig a lot of soil up, and we all got a shiny spade in the car, as it were. But if you typical example, but this was lifted from a field not too far away from here. But if you go to the headland, you find that nice aggregated soil, that very healthy soil. And of course, gone to somewhere where there's a lot of traffic. This is not a gateway, but it is a tram line. And you compare those two soils, that's just a few meters apart. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the results of, yes, tillage, but primarily a lot of weight going over that soil at the same time. Too many passes, probably too many axle loads, too high tire pressures. And nothing's going to grow in that. And you can see from our trial out there, where we've had heavy axle loads from a trailer and a tractor, nothing's grown in it. Yet where we've got a lighter load and can manage tire pressures, manage axle weights, we've got plants growing. So it is, much of the variability, I would argue, that we're seeing in our fields, we measure hell of that with sophisticated equipment, and we apply nutrients variably, and all of that has merit. But I think, as we heard from the first speaker in this morning, is that much of our soil and much of the variability we're experiencing is just simply high bog densities, and as a result, compaction. So it's very damaging, and we have to manage it very, very carefully. The good news is that we have the knowledge, and we do have technology, and we can mitigate it to a huge degree, to be honest with you. So traffic is one way we can manage, and I don't know if Tim's here, but Tim Chambers done a great job in the controlled traffic farming group, and in different crop systems and production systems, we will traffic different amounts of the field. And I think you'd be frightened just how much of the field you are trafficking. But here's a couple of pieces of research, one in potatoes, and of course one, not in this country, but one in wheat, where we can traffic easily 50, 60, 70% of the field in one production system, in one cycle. You put the wrong tyres on that tractor or that machine, you put too high axle weights, you put wrong tyre pressures, and you can work it out. The damage is huge, and the potential damage to yield is even bigger. So most agricultural rotations traffic probably more than 70% of the field, if we're honest. And one of the great benefits of guidance, we love a little bit of bling, but one of the great benefits of guidance more recently is that guidance, specifically, the high accuracy guidance systems now, has really reduced the amount of traffic, reduced overlap, all that stuff. And one of the biggest benefits for me is not savings of fatigue, and that's all good, but it's what we've done to our soils by reducing the amount of traffic and passes in the field. So, the first pass will always cause the most damage. Generally, the first pass is the front axle of the tractor. And so there's a message there, because quite often we find front axles with great big weights on the front of tractors, high tire pressures, high front axle weights. And of course, you combine those sort of things together and you quickly getting into a very dangerous place, really. Again, good work from Tim, but multiple passes, I've mentioned that already, but if you have multiple passes of high tire pressures, high axle loads, your structure is not going to improve. And we'll see some pictures of the structure that we've dug out here in our simple trial, and you can see quite a devastating effect on soil structure that even one pass, or two passes in our case, has had on our soil structure. And again, you can see it, and you can see it in our trial out there, instead of that nice aggregated structure, okay, it's very dry, and out there you get this platy structure, and of course the platy structure really does result in very poor plant and root development. So it's extremely damaging, and I can't really underestimate that. And it's an extremely fragile environment in which we're planting. We kind of take soils for granted. You get the average student who comes into the field with a tractor and trailer, he runs up to the combine, he unloads, and he swings around in a big arc with a loaded trailer. The soil's a bit wet, comes back out of the field, and the damage is quite horrendous. So it's a very fragile ecology, as I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted, as we all really appreciate, really. So I guess the bottom line, before we even think about machinery, the fundamental building block of soil health is obviously our carbon. With that, soil quality starts to improve, and many aspects of machinery management in the field actually improve by virtue of the fact that we're actually improving our soil health through a higher level of organic content within our soil. So, there's lots of opportunities for reducing our tillage. We all know that, you can't just go straight away into no-till with high bulk densities and very cloddy structure. But you get good aggregation in our soils, then, so you've got really good opportunities to reduce tillage, and of course that reduces number of passes, and it reduces compaction, and it kind of compounds itself in a positive way. You get more timeliness within the soil because the friability of the soil is more friable over a longer period of time. Our soil structure improves, more resilience to compaction. Actually, soil with good organic content can be much more resilient to weights and pressure, as well as managing our water. And of course, if we don't manage our water on the surface of our soils, then we can't get our machines on there. And if we do get our machines on there, we again cause an awful lot of damage. And of course, with every positive, there's a negative way of looking at that. If we don't manage our soil health, we start to degrade our soils or allow our soils to be degraded. Of course, many of our opportunities to manage our machinery well also start to decline as well. So before we talk about the machines itself, the fundamental building block, as if everything we've been listening to at Groundswell really is building our soil carbon, really. So weight does impact soils. And if we go back 10 years, weight would have impacted soils more than they perhaps do today, because Tyre technology, and Tom will share more details in a moment, Tyre technologies, or particular polymer technologies, and the ability to reduce pressures has mitigated weight to some extent. So that's really good news, because technology can help us. But if we look at a healthy soil, and we've heard it many times, half of that soil wants to be stuff, and we call that bulk density. The other half of it wants to be porosity, and that's the space that either water or air can occupy, and that will change during the course of the year, as you can appreciate, but typically we see it there at field capacity. We come along with our nice shiny machines, and we all like them. We're all very interested and passionate about our machines, but very quickly, if we're not very careful, we don't manage that interface very well, then we can squeeze that soil down, and of course the mineral fraction just gets squeezed into higher bulk densities. The bit that leaves is the important bit, which is our porosity, and we reduce the amount of oxygen in our soil, and that has a big effect on our plant health, and we reduce the amount of water in our soils, and generally that water then sits on top of our soils, and that causes problems like denutrification and all sorts of things like that. So, the problems compound themselves if we let them build up, but if we start to manage them well, then things will start to improve as well. So it's an area that we're passionate about trying to train people and educate people of how to do this really well. And operators are really key. I'll share more about that, but operators are really, really key. So just moving a little bit along, we're looking at tyres in particular then. As I think all of you will be aware that, as you increase axle loadings, and we do this very, very carefully, almost, not carefully, but we almost do it, without thinking. And you very often see a tractor going along the road with a massive amount of weight hanging out the front of the tractor just because it looks good. But the damage is quite incredible. So as we increase our axle loads, this is very old research, and many of you have seen it before, of course, our compaction at depth goes up. And you'll see some of that results in our compaction trial. So compaction in our topsoil predominantly is dominated by tire pressures, but yet compactions further down in the subsoil is more dominated by axle loads. And one of the things that we've done there, and we've done it at different locations, is bury an airbag, further down the soil profile, run different machines over it, measure the pressure the impact is having at depth. So, that's a nice theory, but you'll see from the results in a minute, it actually does replicate into real world situations. So the good news, and it is really good news, but you'll see what we mean by that in just a moment, is that modern tyre technology, and Tom will touch more on that in a minute, but what we mean by that is IF technology and VF technology, and also training as well, particularly of operators, because the operators spend most time in the machines, most time in the fields, and if you get an operator who doesn't spend time thinking about weight, thinking about pressures and how he traffics the field, that operator can do huge amounts of damage. So I really encourage you, we can help you in that to make sure operators really understand some of these issues really. But modern tyre technology can truly compensate for weight. But we couldn't have said that 10 years ago because we didn't have much of the exciting tyre technology that we do today. And of course, this one's possibly even more damaging than the one that we often see, is that, more traffic on the field, result at higher moisture contents. And this was a really good opportunity for us because we set this trial up when it was dry in the morning and it very quickly rained, and it rained very hard. We got soaked doing it, but it was a great opportunity because we had loosened wet soil, which is arguably one of the most high-risk environments, heavy soil as well. So as soil moisture increases, of course, our ability to compact soils go up, and it goes up at depth as well. So as soil moisture increases, it can withstand less weight. I think most of you understand that, and it's more prone to compaction, smearing, and wheel slip, and lots of other negative consequences that don't do our soil health a huge amount of good, really. And compaction can go deep, and we've tried to measure that in a fairly basic way, and you'll see that in a moment. But as this is some very broad numbers, so don't pin me on any of these, but some very broad numbers. But essentially, as axle weight increases, and we're particularly interested in axle weights, not just vehicle weights, then of course our compaction will go deeper. And and that depends on the depth of the soil, it depends on moisture content, it depends on lots of things, but it can go extremely deep. And of course, once it starts to go down at these sort of depths, then trying to get back out again, unless you have a summer like we had in 2018 where it reset a lot of our heavy soils, thankfully, is extremely challenging to get it back out of our soils. So you have to ask yourself a few questions, and it's a good time of year to ask those questions, because within a few months, a lot of machines are going to traffic a lot of fields, a lot of soils, and the ability to make decisions now to mitigate the damage or not make decisions and end up doing a lot of damage. The soils could be a little bit vulnerable because we've had some moisture, and so I think it's a good time to just stop and think about this, because decisions you make today could have quite lasting negative impacts if you don't get it right. So I guess one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, how much weight do I actually need on our machines? It's a question that very few people know how to answer. And very importantly, where do I put it? Okay. So I always say to people when they buy a new machine, a tractor in particular, you must have the ability to add or take away 3 tons of weight on a typical sort of mid-sized large tractor. So when you spec it up, you've got to be able to take the 3 tons off or add 3 tons on fairly easily. And that's quite a rule of thumb, but it's an important one to just think. So, if you're in heavy applications, for every horsepower you're trying to transmit to the ground, you need about 50 kilograms of weight to effectively do that. I'll show an example in a moment. For a medium application, so that's typically drilling, and very often we find drilling tractors loaded up at this weight where you simply don't need that amount of weight. That's 45 kilograms per horsepower. That's your 3-ton difference on a 300 horsepower tractor, basically. And then light applications, or any other applications really, then you want to get your power to weight ratio as low as you possibly can. And it's very hard to get to 35 kilograms per horsepower, and some of the modern tractors we're developing now and other people are developing, where you get high horsepower at low weight, we are getting the ability to get down now to those mid and early 35 and below kilograms per horsepower. So, the important message is don't carry more weight than you need to, because that's the really damaging thing. And it costs you in lots of different ways. It costs you in ways of soil health, but there's lots of other aspects as well. It results in, you increasing pressures to withstand that weight, increased rut depths. You'll see the damage that we've done out there, compaction at depth, and very importantly, it costs you fuel. And if you're not interested in anything else, then fuel is a big cost. It's around sort of 25, 26, even up to 50% in the lifetime of ownership of a tractor. Up to 50% could be just fuel costs alone. So, 1 ton, this is a rule of thumb, doesn't matter what color you paint the bonnet, but 1 ton of additional unrequired ballast, okay, is approximately 1 litre of fuel per hour of use. Okay, so if you're carrying 3 tons extra in this scenario, you're drilling with this tractor here, you're carrying 3 tons more than you need to. That's 3 litres an hour, 10 an hour. I'm doing simple sums, but that's 30 litres a day. You would do the maths. It all adds up. So just be careful. The other question we have to ask us, well, here's an example, a 300 horsepower tractor in heavy draft application typically is going to be weighing somewhere around 16.5 tons to get all of that horsepower to the ground. But if you go drilling like that, you really need to be able to remove 3 tons of weight fairly easily. There's lots of different ways we can do that these days. But if you don't move those 3 tons of weight, that's where the price comes in fuel consumption, damage to our soils, and many other things as well. And the other really important thing is to get the tractor ballasted properly in terms of weight distribution. So if you're carrying 50% of the weight on the front, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out those tractors are a lot smaller. You have to increase the pressure to withstand that weight, and the power will go where the weight is. So you're transmitting 50% of that tractor power through the front axle. Okay, you'll get limited, much reduced performance from that machine. So the first question you ask is, what am I doing? How much weight do I carry? Where do I put it? Really important questions, simple questions, and we can certainly help you with that. And then you need to understand this effective weight transfer. And I always indicate this person, I won't go through all the maths because it's a fairly simple sum, but very often, I'm driving along the road, I see tractors coming towards with enormous weights, and I mean like 3,000 kilograms hanging off the front of the tractor with a trailer on the back, for example, or even in the field drilling, and I'll see you a couple of examples, and it doesn't matter what color you paint the tractor, we're all kind of guilty of it, but it's hugely damaging, and I'll give you 2 examples. There's a simple sum if anybody wants to work at it, but you just need to take a few simple measurements, know the weight you're putting on the front of the tractor, and you can see the effects of weight transfer. So here's a couple examples I snapped off social media. So one's not John Deere and one's John Deere, so just to show that there are good tractors on the market, just to be totally unbiased. But here's a tractor with 3,300 kilograms. I'm sure that's right. It needs that sort of weight. Perhaps, I don't know. But any ideas, anybody, how much actual that weight that adds to the axle itself? Well, if you do some simple sums, you look at the distance from the weight to the middle of the front axle, divide it by the wheelbase, times it by the weight itself, it adds 2 tons. Add that to the weight itself, it's 5¼ tons to the front axle. Axle's probably 5 tons already, 6 tons. That's a 10 ton, at least a 10 ton front axle. Okay. Another example, really interesting one. I've used the same dimensions just to keep it the same, but I know that's got an 1,800 kilogram front weight on it. It's drilling on duals. Do you need that weight on the front of the tractor when you're drilling with duals? That's the one question I would ask. That's adding a further ton of weight transfer. Add it to the weight itself. That's adding nearly 3 tons to the front of that tractor. Okay, so that axle weight's probably going to be 9 tons, roughly. Okay. 9 tons is a lot. It's the first pass in the field. It's the one that's going to likely to do most damage. Okay, just think really, really carefully about, do I need that weight? And if I do, where do I put it to get the most effectiveness out of it? And just think about the biggest problem we have, and Tom will say the same when you look at tractors, is tractors are overballasted at the front and carrying too much tyre pressure as a result of that. And you can reduce an awful lot of damage just by making those 2 simple choices, really. So, and there's a lot of this is about training, so an operator understanding, really. So, Tom.
Thank you, David. So yeah, the graph that we're looking at here, guys, we've got moving through the tyre selection choice from a row crop through to a very large volume high flotation tyre, and looking at the effect of pressure, running a row crop at 63 psi or a standard 85 profile tyre typically running at 26 psi. The volume of air that the tyre holds, we could argue it's the balloon, it's containing that volume of air. So the bigger the volume of air that we've got to carry the load, the lower the pressure we can run the tyre at. So the key point there, look for as big a volume tyre as feasibly possible to fit on the tractor to suit the operation, and then get the tyre pressure down. As the bottom graph shows here, we're on a load of 3,800 kilograms per tyre. So going from our very large volume tyre, carrying that load at 9 psi through to the row crop at 63 psi. Okay. So VF and IF technology tyres, and the difference between them and a standard or conventional technology agricultural tyre. Those of you who go back, let's say 15, 20 years ago, a standard 110 horsepower tractor, probably coming into the UK from the manufacturer on something like a 20.838 or an 18.438. They were a common standard size fitment. And those tyres, conventional technology tyres. We've now introduced the Ultraflex technology tyres. VF, meaning the tyre can carry a 40% reduction in pressure for the same load versus its conventional counterpart. IF, meaning the tyre can carry a 20% reduction in pressure versus its same size conventional technology counterpart.
Yep, good. So just before we get on to the actual results of our trial, then I think it's just to understand a little bit about the biology of soil compaction, because a lot of numbers are thrown around and people don't quite understand what they're looking at with a penetrometer or with bulk density. So you measure bulk density simply by a small known volume you push into the soil. Sometimes it's very hard to do. It's impossible to do on the soils out here because they're very, very stony. And then you simply dry that soil, oven dry that soil, weigh it. You know the volume, you can get to a bulk density number. No one ever does that, or very few unless you're interested. But so most people use a penetrometer. I'll come on to that in a moment. But in our uncompacted soil, the most maximum compaction really you can get a soil to is 2.6 grams per cubic centimetre. You half that, it's 1.3. That's about 50% of it is soil, 50% of it is airspace. So that's an ideal, and we know, most plant roots thrive in that type of environment. You then start to compact the soil, and very quickly, if you go around measuring with a penetrometer, you can get to these sort of numbers around 250 psi extremely quickly. 1.5, you're starting to get into a root limiting environment. And once you get into sort of 1.6 and further on, then it's game over for most of our plant species, unless you've got some very careful pivotal root systems and special biology that you can get down there really. So, if you go around and measure other environments, you start to learn just how compacted our soils are really, because woodlands have very low, it's a high organic environment, but very low bulk densities if you do that sort of work. But most of our clay and most of our loams, and you'll see the work we've done out here, are somewhere between 1.5, 1.7 and more. But I would argue really to get plant roots, really the morphology of our roots really exploring our soil, then it needs to be around about 1.2 and even less if you can. And soil organic matter, if you look at it, a pile of compost, then it's extremely low, but that's just out of interest more than anything. So it's important just to understand the relationship between bulk density, because we often talk about bulk density, and what you see on a penetrometer in terms of PSI, or some of them are on kilopascals, and there's a simple conversion at the bottom of the page there. Good, Tom.
So on to the results of the trial that David and my colleague Gordon Brooks have put in here at Groundswell. So the background was to provide a simple trial to visibly show the effects on physical soil health of the tractor and trailers with various tyre technologies. So we've used a set of VF tyres, we'll come on to more detail on that in the next minute, to show you the varying pressures and the effects that has with the given axle loads. 4 tractor and trailer runs were completed up the field. So the first one, run number 1, the John Deere 6145 with a loaded trailer for the maximum UK permissible axle and gross train weights on standard tyres. Then run 2, the same, or 6150, then with loaded trailer, same vehicle combination with unoptimised tyre pressures, a road pressure. Run number 3 then using the VF technology tyres with the tyres optimised for field operation. And the 4th run that was done was using a high horsepower, 370 horsepower tractor on IF technology tyres to illustrate to you the effects that sort of vehicle has running on the soil structure. Okay. Various testing was then done on the wheelings and the untrafficked areas of the plot, including water infiltration rates, the soil resistance, the rut depth behind the tractor wheels and trailer wheels, the rear tyre contact patch area, soil pressure, soil structural effects are visible. I hope you'll come up to the plot afterwards and have a look. You can clearly see the effects at the high pressure and the soil shear strength. Those results were all correlated by David. And coming up in the presentation. The soil type that we've got up there, it's a sloping site, medium heavy clay loam, 5.5% soil organic matter. High stone fraction, you'll clearly see that when you go up. Moisture content, 22% on the day that they put the wheelings in. It had started to rain and continued to rain down for the rest of the day. So the motley crew that put this together, I'm standing in actually for my colleague Gordon Brooks, the guy in the Michelin overalls there, assisted by Gary Buckle from P. Tuckwell and Scott Kirbisher, and obviously David, we all know. Next one, please. Cutting edge scientists. I doubt whether I'd go that far, David. So here's some pictures of what we achieved. We were using the farm's trailer, so not running on a Michelin flotation tyre, but a competitor's flotation tyre. You can see the effects of the weather in the wheelings there. This picture here showing the airbag buried under the soil structure and the gauges measuring the pressure. The footprint measurements that we done, the run with the 8370 as a single tractor. And the wheelings then behind the single tractor wheel. In terms of the tyre technology, I won't bore you too much, but safe to say on run number 1 we were running on standard tyres, 520, 85, 38 rear tyres. Those tyres, with the load that they're being asked to carry, have to run at a pressure of 29 psi, okay? They had to run at that pressure in order to carry that load. Remember, there's a direct correlation between the pressure in the tyre and what's going down into the soil structure. So if we're running that tyre at 29 psi, we'd say for a good quality radial tyre, you take into effect what we call the casing factor, another 1 to 2 psi. So 30, 31 psi is going to be going down into the soil structure with that pass. That was carrying a load of 8,000 kgs on the rear axle. As we moved through the process, and we upgraded the vehicle to run on the VF Zeobib 710/60/38 tyre. This tyre has the ability to carry that same load, but now at 14 psi. That's that tyre's maximum pressure, 14 psi, and it's able to carry that sort of load at a high speed as well. So it's a great tyre for coming out of the field and onto the road, especially during harvest. Let's say when you're hauling grain over a long distance. The third run that we did then was we optimised those VF tyres to suit the conditions in terms of the load they're carrying. So as I said, the maximum pressure for that tyre is 14 psi. We could afford to run it at 10 psi with that load. And again, that's at a high speed as well. It's able to do that at high speed. So bringing the pressure down from 29 to 10 psi, you'll be very visual effects in terms of what you can see in terms of the rut depth up there on the plot, and the results that David has correlated, further proof that reducing the pressure improves the performance. And then on the run number 4 with the 8370 on the IF tyres, so these being the high horsepower Ultraflex equivalent, 11 psi running in those tyres.
Great. I mean, it's important to say this is not a fully replicated piece of science, obviously, so we're not trying to suggest it is. We need the whole field to do that. And, you know, we had to get together the machines that were easily to hand. And what we wanted to compare is standard tyres, VF tyres and IF tyres, and that's what we've managed to achieve. So don't make direct comparisons between each run, because it's clearly not like that. So just to try and assess some of the agronomic impacts, these are some of the response variables we looked at. So data, we used a data field penetrometer, thanks to Shamal Mohammed. Some of you will know Shamal works at Cranfield. And then we used a pressurized airbag, which we buried at 25 centimeters, connected to a pressure gauge. We could then work out what the peak pressures were at that sort of depth. We used a shear strength vane tester. That very much gives us an indication of emergence and plant populations. And it's very interesting what's grown and what's not grown behind the wheelings on our thing. And finally, a simple infiltrometer just to measure infiltration rates. And on top of that, we did a simple structural. We heard more about that this morning. We looked at rut depths and measured those. Tyre contact areas, axle weights and tyre pressures were also measured. So reasonably robust. And we spent a lot of time collecting the data and multiple readings. So we feel really confident that we've got not replicated, but some pretty good data, really. So just to go run through it very quickly. Looking at penetrometer data, you know, it's very nice to have all these in a straight line, but in reality that's, and this is quite challenging in the soil types we've got here because it's very stony, so it's not actually particularly easy to do, but we did two lots of these, one on the day and one a couple of weeks later, so we're confident of the data we've got. But this is a black line, really is no disturbance, so it's in between the wheelings. That's the kind of original state of the soil. The green line above it, so we're really interested in this area here, because that's where the action happens. Shallower than that, then roots will probably explore. Deeper than that, if you look at the soil, probably the roots aren't going to get there. And then we've got the VF tyre. This is the solid lines of the tractor tyres, so that's a pretty good result. And then we've got muddled in here, we've got our standard tyres and our IF tyres and the VF tyres set to road pressures, essentially. And then you can see the damage from the 3 runs that our trailer wheelings are doing on top of that. Okay, so early, right from a penetrometer looking, then we're considerably going to have a big impact here upon our routing of our crops in behind those. In fact, we're going to limit them completely, and you can see in most of the wheelings we've been very successful at doing that. So we've run that work in other locations as well, just to kind of make sure we understand the data. So this is the same tyres, same pressures, but run on very light sandy soil, ballasted up to pretty much identical situations. And you can see even on light sandy soil where, you know, the penetrometer just disappears out of sight very quickly, you know, we put the VF tyre and then the standard tyre, the difference is quite considerable between those tyres. And it just gives you, because there's no stones in that soil, it just gives you a clear idea of just how that compaction evolves through the profile of the soil as well. And the other piece of work we did before we moved back to this trial is a lot of people ask us, well, what about track machines? Because that seems to be the answer to all our ills. So we thought, well, we'll put 2 very large track machines. This is over on fairly light sandy soil as well, or medium sandy soil, shall I say. Same undisturbed. And then we put 2 track machines, similar weight, similar configuration, but different types of tracks really over our soils. I won't go and tell you which ones are which. It's not the place for that. But what we really found when we did the infiltration rates behind it is that this reading here, and it spikes the soil, and often people say this, a track machine spikes the soil around 10 centimeters, but this resulted in a half the infiltration rate. So just a small change here killed our infiltration rates on our soil. So, just track machines are very good, but then they need to be. You need to understand what they're doing to our soils as well. So when you look at penetrometer results, obviously what you're looking at is a variable amount of bulk density through our soils, and this is what you often find: relatively low bulk densities. It's increasing. Then you hit where the tyres really compacted the soil at this sort of 10 centimetre area. It sort of lightens up, as you can see by the graph. And then obviously when you hit some subsoil or heavier soil further down, then it tightens back up again. So that's what you see. And of course, compaction is the absence of spore space, and aggregation, as you saw from my pictures early on. It's restriction of water and nutrients, very importantly, but also, as we've learned very much, it's the absence really of a habitat. Microbes love aggregation, and we remove that, and of course we reduce the biological life in our soil. So that's a really important aspect of managing tyres and managing weight. So this was the most staggering finding. We did this several times because we couldn't quite believe our own data, but we kept getting the same result. You can see what it looks like because it was a reasonably wet day. But this is infiltration rates. So this is with no traffic whatsoever. This is the first run with the trailer behind it. So that's that run to the left there. And we killed infiltration rates, absolutely killed it. And you can see on the soil there, you don't need to test it. You can visually see that. And even the VF tyre running at the wrong pressure for the field also did an awful lot of damage to infiltration rates. But then when we reduced it to the right pressure in the field, and we did this several times just to make sure of our own findings, you can see we almost got our infiltration right back to where the original state of the soil. So the real message in there is that, if you spend the money on the tyres, that's great. But if you don't spend the money on education and get the pressure right, okay, you probably, to some extent, I'm sure Tom will agree with me, you waste your investment. Okay, so it's buying the technology and getting the training, the operator to understand how to set them up, which is critically important. The other thing from this work, then, you see also by taking 30 psi out of the tyre, the trailer tyres, so we simulated having low flotation tyres on our trailer, you also dramatically increase the infiltration rate behind the trailer as well. So we did that several times. It's quite a nice result, and we got pretty much the same result every time we did it, really. So very, very important, good indication of soil structure infiltration rates are. And of course, there's lots of potential environmental impacts. You've got things like soil erosion down the tram lines, if that's the way you want to, rainfall runoff, with it phosphate, which comes off with the soil, denitrification, and it's very persistent. So be very, very, very careful, as I said to you earlier. And wheel slip often results. Because this sort of environment, if you get your tyre pressures, you'll get wheel slip, and often now that's where we're seeing a lot of blackgrass emergency behind wheel slip, and rut depths, as I said to you already, increase fuel usage quite dramatically. 1 psi in a tyre can probably result in 3 to 4% more fuel usage, just to give you some idea. So then we looked at rut depths very quickly. It's just a measure of rut depths, but you can see from the first run, the standard tyres, then we've got big rut depths of 55 millimetres. Then the VF tyre just completely shuts that down to 10 millimetres, although the trailer doesn't do as much good. Trailers are very damaging, especially if you've got the wrong tyres on the trailer. And again, the VF at the right pressure, and even the IF tyre on the very big tractor, 20 millimetres. So very important rut depths, because increasing rut depths means you're trying to push through a wave of soil. If you were doing that on a push bike, you'd get run out of energy. But because you're in a big tractor with bling, leather seats and a radio on, you don't really notice it, but it is using fuel, and it's using it at a high rate. Okay, just between those two would be a big difference in fuel consumption. So that's something else we found. And then we measured contact area underneath the tyre. And the blue ones are Michelin's published figures, but we actually found much bigger contact area. So this is a standard tyre, and this is in cubic centimetres. That's the VF tyre, both of the VF tyres. We didn't do it on the very large tractor. This one running at 14 psi and that one running at 10 psi. So contact area increases quite dramatically, and we took some pictures of that. It was raining quite hard, so the picture's a bit blurred, but you can see the difference in contact areas there, hopefully. You push that on a bit. Okay, the video should be the other way up, but we then buried this airbag at 25 centimetres and then ran the tractor over it. You'll have to quick your neck for that one. Sorry about that. It should be the other way around. It was around the other way. But basically, we took a video of each run. So we got and then we run it back in slow motion. So we got a peak pressure for each wheeling that went over that airbag that we buried in the soil. And although I don't claim that this is pure absolute reading relatively to different runs. It's very, very accurate. So it's been quite useful. So that's the sort of data we got. I won't go through it all, but sorry, that's gone over one slide too many. There we go. Peak pressures at 25 centimeters. So this is the two tractor wheelings on the standard tyres. This is the two wheelings on the trailer. Then you've got the VF. You can see that's putting a lot less pressure down at 25 centimeters at 14 psi, and then this is the VF tyre at 10 psi. And sadly, the trailer, if you don't do the damage with the tractor and you've got the wrong wheels on the tyres on the trailer, you will definitely do damage with the trailers. And these are very basic non-flotation tyres on the trailer here. So tractor wheelings did a great job, but the trailer wheelings came in, messed it up again. But really interesting how the effects at 25 centimeters. Then we did use the shear vane to measure stresses. We did this about a month later or a couple of months later, because we did this work back in May. So this is like a little torque wrench you put into the soil to measure the shear force of soil. So undisturbed soil, it just shears very, very easily. And then as you go through the different tyre technologies, you'll see that the shear force increases dramatically under the trailer, which are the orange lines. But again, the VF tyre performs pretty well, especially the front axle and the rear axle. Shear force is a really good indication of, gives you an indication of plant emergence and plant population. So if you can get that at the right number, then that's some limited amount of work being done on it, but that's a good indication of plant population and emergence of a crop. We also then, last week when we came and dug the trench right across the plot, we also put the shear vane in sideways at 12 centimetres. I've never done that before, but I thought that'd be an interesting piece of data to look at. So again, no traffic. And the interesting thing from this is that the VF tyre, which is this one here running at the correct pressure, really didn't increase the shear force at 12 centimetres, whereas the other tyres, you can see, had quite an effect down at 12 centimetres. So I think we dug some samples, did a little bit of visual inspection, and no surprises here, but where the traffic's not been, you see good aggregation. It's very stony soil, as you can see. As soon as we put the trailer and tractor over it, and this is behind the tractor and trailer, you see you get this platy soil structure, and that's what does the damage. That's what reduces your infiltration rates to some extent, okay, and that's what's going to prevent any real emergence and plant health and rooting, really. And then I took this picture last week. You can see what's going on. And if you look at there now, it's quite interesting, because if you look where we've dug the trench right across the site, everything south of that is tractor and trailer. So we put the pit in the right place. Everything north of it is just tractor wheelings. So we've put the plot where we finished with the tractor wheelings. And you can see quite a lot of cover crops are emerging across the tractor wheelings, especially those at low pressures. But no plants really are emerging behind the trailer wheelings. So that we can't measure that, can't give you a number, but it's a good indication that if you get your tyre pressures right, then, or if you get them wrong, you're going to have quite a devastating effect upon rooting and plant emergence, really. So, good. Just to finish off with then, some of you may have come across this, but if you want to model things that you're doing in your field, this is a very slow website. You have to be extremely patient with it. But this is an interesting piece of work that's done by some Danish academics and other people, and you can put all your numbers, axle weights, tyre pressures, everything into this, and it will throw out some results. So I put, oops, there should be a slide there, but never mind. Okay, so I modelled the 6150 that we've got out there on correct pressures, and it was comforting to know that the readings that we were getting out of this model were very similar to the readings we got out of. I won't go through them all, but we got out of our own data as well. So it just confirmed that our measurements were fairly close, to be honest with you. But if you want to model it, go to that website, put your numbers in, but be patient. It's extremely slow. I found it extremely slow. So just in conclusion then, I think probably I don't need to add too much. I hope you've seen some of the results, but machinery and traffic are critically important. So I can't overemphasize that. You drive around in the spring when crops are emerging, you see the damage for yourself through all the wheelings, but they're critically important to managing soil and plant health. Fairly obvious statement, but it's worth making nonetheless. But tyre technology is critical, so the choice of tyres is critical, and it's as critical as axle weight these days, because good tyres can mitigate the damage done by axle weight. So a heavy axle load can be in part mitigated by tyre technology and correct pressures. That's the interesting work that we found here and found in other places as well. So the message is, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but invest time in getting pressures right. Okay, so when you're on soil, don't compromise. Really, really don't compromise. Don't think I'll split it halfway. You know, a few more psi won't make any difference in the field because then I can drive home and get my cup of tea at 50k. Trust me, that 4 psi, as you've seen from there, is having quite a devastating effect on infiltration rates and many other aspects of soil health as well. So get it right in the field. Trailers can be very damaging, so invest in tyres on trailers and get the pressures right. 30 psi difference. You saw some of the staggering differences we got from 30 psi difference in trailers. Keep them to the tram lines. Don't get the student to swing round in an arc with a full trailer on wet soil. Make that the last job he does, in a sense. And keep to the tram lines and keep off the headlands if you possibly can. So really manage traffic in the field very carefully, especially when you've got high axle weights, heavy soils, wet conditions, high tyre pressures. Be very, very careful because you'll arguably never get that damage back out again. So traffic the soil less, spread it more, get the right tyres, carry it the right weight for the task. And the very important, this is one area of passion of mine really, is train the key stakeholders. For me, the key stakeholders are the operators, because they're often responsible for setting pressures. They're often responsible for how they traffic in the field and managing their machines, managing weight. And if we don't involve them in this and really train them well, and dealers that can really run quite high value training now, they know all this science, and get their arms around some of these operators and get them to really understand. This is the time of year to do it, because often you get students coming in to help you. They're probably just very keen on driving tractors and less keen on this, but they can have a huge positive or quite considerable negative effect. So training is really, really critical. So the bottom line really is invest in tyres and optimization and training. Okay, so that's me and Tom done. I don't know if there's any questions.